The alarm went off at 3:14 in the morning, ship time. It was not a gentle alarm. It was the kind of alarm that punched you out of sleep and dropped you on the floor before your brain had finished loading. Cole Briggs was already at his navigation panel by the time his eyes were fully open, hands moving on instinct, pulling up readouts he was not yet awake enough to read properly. The numbers came back wrong. Not a little wrong. Not rounding ever wrong. The kind of wrong that made a man sit very still and read the same line 4 times, hoping it would change. It did not change. The ardent margin had jumped. That part worked. The experimental drive had fired. The ship had folded through a pocket of bent space, and it had come out the other side exactly as Rei Okubo had promised it would. Clean exit. Good numbers on the hull. Drive temperature nominal. The problem was where it had come out. Cole stared at the star map on his screen. Then he stared at the star map on the backup screen. Then he pulled up the physical paper chart that Nadia Fenn kept taped inside the navigation bay door, because she did not trust screens, and he stared at that too. None of them matched where they were supposed to be. They were supposed to be somewhere near the Kelvin Drift, a quiet, empty stretch of unmapped space, about 9 light-years from the nearest recorded outpost. Empty. Quiet. Perfect for testing an experimental drive that was, technically, running without full clearance. They were not near the Kelvin Drift. He was still working out exactly where they were when the second alarm went off. This one was different. This one came from the external sensor array, and it had a sound like a throat being cleared by something very large and very serious. Captain Dale Harmon came through the bridge door at a walk. He had his coffee mug in his hand, half full, and he was wearing the same gray jacket he wore every morning. He looked at Cole. He looked at the sensor readout. He looked at the view screen. The view screen was full of ships. Not 2 or 3 ships, not a patrol group. 47 ships, arranged in a formation so precise and so deliberate that it looked less like a fleet and more like a wall. They were big. The smallest one in the formation was 3 times the length of the ardent margin. The largest was the size of a city block. They were dark, angular, and they were pointed directly at the ardent margin with the calm, patient energy of something that had never once needed to hurry. Dale looked at all of this. He said, "Huh." 1 word. He took a sip of his coffee. Cole turned around in his chair. "Captain, the jump. There was the calculation had a variable that I didn't account for, and the drift margin was wider than. You got to count on those ships?" 47, sir. They moving? No, sir. Holding position. They pointing at us? Cole looked at the screen. Yes, sir. Dale nodded. He took another sip of coffee. He walked to his chair and sat down with the slow, unhurried motion of a man settling in for a long conversation with a stuck engine part. Pam Ortega had come up from the engine bay at the sound of the second alarm. She came through the door with grease on her left forearm and a wrench in her back pocket. She looked at the view screen. She looked at the engine readout panel on the side wall. She went to the engine readout panel. "Pam," Dale said. "The drive ran hot on exit," she said, not turning around. "If those ships are going to do something, they're going to do it in the next few minutes anyway. I'd rather know the drive isn't going to catch fire at the same time." Nobody argued with that logic. Lena Vasquez arrived next, coffee in hand, hair not quite sorted. She stood in the doorway and looked at the view screen for a long, quiet moment. She had the expression of someone who had just identified an unusual specimen in a sample tray. Interested, alert, slightly possessive about it in the way scientists got when something new appeared in front of them. "Those aren't any configuration I've seen in the database," she said. "No," Nadia Fenn said from the communications console, where she had been sitting for the last 4 minutes in total silence, headphones on, notebook open, writing things down with a focus so complete she looked like she had forgotten the 47 warships existed. "They're broadcasting on a frequency band we don't use. 17 simultaneous language streams. I've got rough phoneme maps on 4 of them already. Dale looked at her. You're getting language data from this? They're hailing us, Nadia said. She tapped the side of her headphones. Have been for about 3 minutes. They're saying something on repeat. Very formal cadence, very structured syntax. She paused. I think it might be a legal statement. A legal statement? Like a formal charge, or a demand. She flipped a page in her notebook. Working on which? Rei Okubo came in last. He was dressed, which meant he had been awake. His eyes went straight to the view screen, and stayed there. He was very still for a moment. Then, he went to the drive console, and started running numbers in the quiet, focused way of a man doing math on something he already knew the answer to, and was hoping he was wrong about. He was not wrong about it. The drift margin, he said, mostly to himself. Yeah, Cole said. I thought the sabbatical parameters shouldn't have, yeah. Ray sat down. He looked at the screen. He looked at his numbers. He looked at the screen again. Claire Dunn came in, sat down, and without being asked, took everyone's pulse by pressing 2 fingers to each crew member's wrist in turn as she passed them. She made a small note on her pad. Everyone's fine, she said. Ray's elevated, but he was already elevated before the jump. She looked at Ray. You were elevated before the jump. I was aware, Ray said. Dale set down his coffee mug. He looked at the view screen. Can you broadcast back on their frequency? Already set up. All right. He leaned forward. Open it up. Nadia hit the switch. Dale said, into 47 warships worth of silence. Appreciate the reach out. We seem to have taken a wrong turn somewhere. Is there a traffic authority we should be talking to? Or somebody in charge of? He waved a hand at the screen. At all of it. The fleet, and the formation, and the pointed guns. All this. Silence. 6 full seconds of it. Nadia was writing in her notebook. Lena was studying the ship configurations. Pam was still checking the engine panel. Cole was staring at his hands. Dale leaned back in his chair and picked up his coffee mug. He waited. That was the thing about Dale Harmon that the 47 ships outside did not yet know, and would spend a considerable amount of time trying to understand. He was very good at waiting. He had waited out hurricanes on a rig in the Gulf. He had waited out 3-day pressure failures in equipment that should have killed the whole crew. He had waited out budget committees and supply delays, and equipment that refused to work, and weather that refused to clear. 47 warships pointed at him was a new category of problem. It was still a problem. He had coffee. He would wait. Fleet Sovereign Veth Oranu had given the fire order exactly once in her career. Once was enough. Once was how you learned what it cost, not in ships or in lives, but in the quiet that followed, the kind of quiet that sat in your chest for years and did not move. She did not give the fire order lightly. She did not give it at all unless the situation was clear, and the law was clear, and there was no remaining question about what had to happen. The situation was clear, the law was clear. She had not given the fire order. Her second-in-command, standing 1 step behind her left shoulder, had not said anything about this yet. He was very good at not saying things. She had chosen him partly for that reason, but she could feel the question coming off him like heat off a panel. On the view screen, the small human ship sat exactly where it had dropped from jump transit. It was not moving. It was not powering weapons. It was not attempting to run, which would have been the logical response from any species that understood where it had landed. It was sitting still, and it had responded to the formal sovereign entry challenge with a question about traffic management. Veth Oranu played that response back a second time. Is there a traffic authority we should be talking to? She turned it over in her mind. She had extensive training in psychological assessment of first contact scenarios. She had spent 11 years studying the documented behavioral profiles of 53 known species under threat conditions. Every profile said the same things in different arrangements. Cornered organisms either attacked or submitted. They signaled aggression or they signaled surrender. They ran if they could run. They begged if they could not. There was no profile for this. There was no profile for a crew that received a sovereign entry ultimatum from 47 warships and responded by asking for a traffic coordinator. She turned to her intelligence officer. "What do we have on the vessel's origin point?" He read from his pad. The ship was human-made. Humans were a young species, maybe 200 years into proper space travel. No known galactic alliances, no empire, no fleet on record. Their entire known presence in space amounted to a handful of research outposts and survey routes. All of them well outside any Dominion-mapped region. 7 crew members, 1 ship, 1 experimental drive that by the technical report her engineers had now reviewed 3 times, should not have been able to produce a jump of the distance and accuracy it had just produced. She asked her chief engineer about that last part. He said carefully that the drive was operating on a principle they did not fully understand yet. She asked if that was a concern. He said also carefully that it depended on what they were concerned about. She looked back at the view screen. The small ship sat there, patient. She had the distinct and professionally uncomfortable feeling that the ship was not waiting to be forgiven. It was waiting to see what happened next. The way you waited to see what happened next when you were not particularly worried about the answer. She decided not to fire. She was not entirely sure why. She ordered the tractor beam engaged and the ship brought into holding dock 7. She ordered a full observation team assigned, and she sent a priority signal to protocol speaker Sen Devar, who was, at that moment, on the Dominion's central station 3 light minutes away, and whose job was exactly this. She also ordered that no one was to tell the humans what the standard outcome of unauthorized sovereign entry was. She wanted to see if they already knew. Inside holding dock 7, the ardent Martian came to rest in a cradle of tractor energy and foreign light. The dock was enormous. It could have held 8 ships their size with room left over. The walls were a dark, polished material that reflected everything back in a slightly wrong way, like looking at yourself in water that was barely moving. Pam Ortega looked at those walls for about 30 seconds. Then she went back to her engine panel. "Pam," Dale said, "still checking the drive." She paused. "Also mapping their tractor frequency." "Why?" "In case we need it later." She shrugged one shoulder. "Probably won't. Just feels right to know." Dale nodded. He did not ask her to stop. Nadia Fenn had both headphones in and 4 separate audio feeds running. She had the dominant Dominion dialect broken down to syntax groups now, which she explained to no one in particular while writing rapidly in her notebook. She said she thought she could manage a basic conversation in about 6 hours. She said this the way someone said they thought they could probably finish a crossword on a long flight. Mildly pleased, not boasting. Ray Okubo was doing the math again. He had been doing the math since the jump. The numbers kept coming back the same way. The drive had worked better than it should have. The margin of error had opened a gap large enough to skip them several sectors past where they were going and deposit them here, inside a sovereign zone he had not known existed, belonging to an empire he had not known existed, surrounded by a fleet that by any reasonable measure should have already reduced them to a field of warm debris. He kept coming back to that last part, the debris part. Claire Dunn found him at the physics console at some point and sat down next to him without saying anything. She had a way of doing that, of just appearing beside you and being very calm and quiet until the thing you were carrying felt slightly less heavy. She did not say it was going to be okay. She did not say anything for a while. Then she said, "You didn't know about the zone." "No," he said. "So it wasn't negligence." It was an undiscovered error in my calculation, which you didn't know about because it had never been tested at this scale. He was quiet. She said, "Eat something," and put a ration bar on the console beside him, and that was the end of that conversation. Sen Devar arrived at the holding dock 4 hours later. He was tall, formal, the kind of formal that had been ironed into his posture over decades until it was structural. He had a staff of 3, all of them carrying documentation. He had delivered the standard extinction ultimatum 17 times in his career. He had a version prepared for species with no auditory language. He had a version prepared for species with no concept of empire. He was thorough. He walked through the airlock into the holding area where the human crew had gathered, and he began his prepared statement, delivered in the dominant Dominion dialect, relying on his translation unit. Dale Harmon waited until there was a natural pause in the statement. Then he held out a mug of coffee. Sen Devar looked at it. The translation unit processed the gesture for 2 full seconds. It returned the classification, offering of sustenance, common diplomatic gesture, low threat index. He took the mug. He did not intend to. His hand moved before the decision had finished forming. The coffee was terrible. It tasted like something that had been brewed from a material that had heard about coffee secondhand. He drank it anyway. He did not know what else to do with it. Dale said, through Nadia's stumbling but improving translation, that they were sorry for the trouble, that they were not here to cause any problems, and would appreciate knowing what the next steps were from the Dominion side. Sen Devar had a response prepared for that too. He began delivering it. Halfway through, he realized something. The humans were not scared. He could read fear. He had seen it in 17 species. It lived in the body in ways that translation could not disguise. It lived in stillness and in over-movement, in the wrong kind of eye contact and the wrong kind of no eye contact. He knew what fear looked like when it was trying to hide. The humans were not hiding anything. The young one with bad posture looked guilty about something. The tall woman with the notebook looked interested. The captain looked, and this was the word Sen Devar's mind kept returning to, like he was waiting for the conversation to get to the useful part. Sen Devar finished his statement. Nobody on the human side said anything for a moment. Then Dale nodded slowly and said that was very helpful, and asked if there was a process they should be following. Sen Devar stood there with his empty coffee mug. For the first time in his career, he did not know what came next. The High Accord met in emergency session. It was not the kind of meeting that started with pleasantries. 7 species, 31 delegates, and a problem that did not fit any existing category in the Accord's 600-year procedural record. Representatives from the Vethkin sat across from the Solar delegates. The Maroon contingent had sent 3 of its senior voices, which was unusual. The Orvan had sent 1, which was typical. They always sent 1, because 1 was usually enough. The session had been running for 4 hours. The dominant view, represented by 5 of the 7 species, was simple. The humans had entered sovereign space, without registration, without clearance, without signal. The law was the law. The incident should be quietly resolved, the record sealed, and the matter closed. The Dominion had spent 6 centuries building a reputation that kept the peace through its weight alone. You did not chip at that weight for the sake of 7 small organisms in 1 small ship. The Vethkin delegate said, "They are not afraid of us." The room went quiet. She said it again, plainly. "I have read Fleet Sovereign Oranu's full report. I have read Protocol Speaker Devar's report. I have now read the observation notes from the holding dock. Not a single human crew member has displayed measurable fear response in over 6 hours of close contact with Dominion forces. This is not bravery. Bravery requires acknowledged fear. This is something else. I want to know what it is before we erase it." The Orvan delegate asked what difference it made. The Vethkin delegate said she did not know yet. That was her point. The session ended without a resolution. That, too, was unusual. Kale Binduros was 29 years old and had been an intelligence officer for 3 years. He was precise, observant, and had a talent for making himself invisible in situations where visibility was a liability. He had been assigned to the holding dock as a direct observer the morning after the ardent margin arrived. He had filed a personal will before going in. He had worded it quietly and told nobody. Now he was sitting at a small table in the common area of the ardent margin's main corridor. Across from him was Claire Dunn, who was reading a novel, a physical one, a book, paper-bound, held open in her hands like something from a museum. The translation unit on his belt could not make sense of the title. She had not looked up when he arrived. She had gestured at the chair across from her with one hand, without breaking her reading, in the universal motion of someone saying, "Sit down. I'm not ignoring you. I'm just busy." He sat down. The part where his training kicked in, and he read the room and identified the angle and the danger. He was very good at that part. Claire turned a page. 20 minutes passed. He found himself watching her read, not in a surveillance way, just watching. She turned pages at a consistent rate. She had a habit of pressing her thumbnail against the corner of the page while she read, not folding it, just holding it. At some point she reached into the pocket of her jacket, took out an apple, and ate it while reading without looking at it once. He had not seen an apple before. He made a note. After 40 minutes she closed the book, looked up, and said something his translation unit rendered as, "You want something to eat?" He said no. Then, because it felt strange to have said nothing else for 40 minutes, he asked what the book was about. She thought about it. A woman who keeps making the same mistake. It's very good. He wrote that down too. Ray Okubo found him the next morning and immediately started explaining the drive. This was not a conversation Kalebind had prepared for. Ray had a way of explaining things that assumed the listener was already deeply interested and just needed the technical part filled in. He drew diagrams on the back of a paper ration wrapper. The diagrams were not good. The physics, as Kalebind translated it back through his technical training, described a jump mechanism that worked by creating a localized fold in the fabric of space, using a resonance pattern that should, by established Dominion physics, have collapsed before it could generate travel distance. He ran the math on his pad 3 times. The math said the drive should not work. He looked at Ray. "Your drive should not function," he said, through the translation unit. Ray considered that for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "We think there's a secondary resonance effect that stabilizes the fold. We haven't fully documented it yet." "You haven't documented it. It's a prototype. We were documenting it by using it." Kalebind looked at the diagram, then at Ray. "You used an undocumented, theoretically impossible drive to jump your crew into unknown space." "We were aiming for empty space," Ray said, in the tone of a man who felt this was a significant distinction. It was not a comforting conversation. And yet, somehow, Kalebind found himself looking at the diagram for the rest of the day, because there was something in the numbers that was wrong in an interesting way, and wrong in interesting ways was the only kind of wrong that ever led anywhere new. Cole Briggs came to find him that afternoon. Kalebind had been briefed on Cole, the navigation officer, the one responsible for the miscalculation. He expected this to be an information-gathering conversation, or a distraction, or some form of practiced human charm, the kind designed to build rapport with an intelligence officer. Cole sat down across from him, clasped his hands on the table, and said, "I want to apologize on behalf of our crew for entering your space without permission." Kalebind waited. That was apparently the whole statement. He said, "You are apologizing?" "Yes," Cole said. "I made the navigation error. It caused the incursion. I'm sorry for the trouble it's caused your people." Kalebind had received many things in his career. He had received threats, offers, bribes framed as gifts, and diplomatic language so layered it took 3 analysts to decode. He had never received a plain apology from someone who was not in a position of weakness. Cole Briggs was not in a position of weakness. Or he was, objectively, but he did not seem to know it. He was apologizing the way you apologized for bumping into someone at a market. Cale Bin said after a moment, "You are not afraid." Cole looked at him. "I'm pretty stressed, actually." "Stressed," Cale Bin said. "I miscalculated and landed my crew inside a major foreign power's sovereign zone. My captain hasn't yelled at me about it, which is somehow worse. And I haven't slept properly in 2 days." He paused. "I'm definitely stressed. But not afraid." Cole thought about that. "I mean, if you were going to do something to us, you probably would have by now." Cale Bin stared at him. Cole added, "Right?" That evening, Nadia Fenn asked Sendavar if she could visit the station library. She phrased it, through her now mostly functional translation, as a genuine request. Not a strategy, not a probe. She said she wanted to read. Sendavar processed this request for several seconds. Every other species that had ever been brought into a dominion-holding situation had spent their time doing 3 things: negotiating for release, looking for escape routes, or attempting to gather intelligence through their most technically capable crew member. He had reports on all 3 of those activities happening with this crew. Pam Ortega had almost certainly mapped their tractor array. Ray Okubo had tried to access an external data node, though whether this was intelligence gathering or just curiosity was genuinely unclear. But one of them wanted to go to the library. He authorized the visit. He did not know why he kept authorizing things he did not have to authorize. That night, Cale Bin sat in his quarters and wrote his intelligence report for the day. He wrote observations about drive technology. He wrote observations about crew behavioral patterns. He wrote about Cole Briggs's apology, and Ray Okubo's diagrams, and Claire Dunn's novel, and her apple. Then he wrote one line that he knew was professionally risky. He wrote it anyway. He wrote, "Recommend non-hostile classification. Reason, they are not afraid of us, and the longer I spend with them, the more I find myself wondering if they are correct not to be." He read it back. He sent it before he could change his mind. The High Accord offered 2 options. The first was a memory wipe and expulsion. The humans would be sedated, their ship would be escorted back across the sovereign boundary, and the entire incident would be sealed from the Dominion record. As far as the galaxy was concerned, it would not have happened. Clean, final. The kind of solution that preserved institutional weight without visible effort. The second option was a formal trial for unauthorized sovereign entry. Full Accord procedure. On record. The outcome was, in the history of the Dominion, never in question once a trial began. Sendavar presented both options to Dale Harmon in the holding room aboard the station. Dale asked one question. "The trial, we get to speak?" "The defendant is permitted to address the Accord, yes." Dale was quiet for about 4 seconds. "We'll take the trial," he said. Sendavar had prepared for the other choice. He had prepared a sedation procedure briefing. He had prepared the escort formation. He had prepared a very specific kind of silence that the end of this situation required. He had not prepared for the trial to be chosen. Nobody chose the trial. The trial chamber was old. Not worn out old, but the kind of old that had been maintained for centuries with the specific purpose of feeling heavy. The walls were dark stone, polished smooth. Every surface reflected the 7 delegation platforms that rose in a graduated arc above the central floor. 1,500 years of Dominion legal tradition had taken place in this room. Every ruling issued from these walls had ended exactly the same way. The 7 human crew members stood on the central floor. Cale Bin Oros watched from the gallery. It had been granted, he suspected. because nobody quite knew what was going to happen, and someone needed to write it down. Dale Harmon was given the floor first. He did not use notes. He said in plain and simple language that Nadia Fen translated in real time, that he was not going to apologize for entering the Sovereign Zone, because his crew had not known the zone existed. You could not apologize honestly for breaking a law you had no way of knowing. That was not how honesty worked, and he was not going to insult the Accord's intelligence by pretending otherwise. He said that his crew came in peace, that this was not a diplomatic phrase, it was an operational fact. They were a survey vessel. Their mission was to test a new drive and map new territory. They carried no weapons capable of threatening any ship in this space. They had not attempted to deceive or harm or exploit any Dominion asset at any point during their time here. He said that if the Accord wanted to send them home, he would respect that decision. But if there was any part of the Accord that was curious about what humans were, what they were doing out here, and what kind of relationship might exist between their people and the Dominion going forward, his crew was standing right here, worth talking to, in his view. He gestured at them. Nadia Fen nodded, notebook in hand. Lena Vasquez exhaled slowly through her nose, the sigh of a person who had known she would be called on eventually. Ray Okubo gave a small wave. Carl Briggs raised one hand slightly and then brought it back down, the wave of a man trying to look professional and not entirely succeeding. The gallery was quiet. Nadia Fen addressed the legal question. She spoke in the Accord's own formal legal dialect. She had learned it in 3 days from a library. She cited articles from the Dominion Charter by number, articles she had located and read during her library visit, and she laid out a case that the standard entry clause applied specifically to registered and identified vessels operating with knowledge of sovereign boundaries. The Ardent Margin was not registered with the Dominion because humanity did not yet have registration with any galactic body. Not by choice, but by the simple fact of not knowing one was required. She did not argue they were innocent. She argued the law as written did not cover them. The Dominion's legal counsel was silent for a long time. Lena Vasquez was called to address the question of why the humans did not appear to register the threat the Dominion represented. She said the Dominion was impressive. She was not saying that to be polite. The scale of the fleet, the legal infrastructure, the multi-species governance model, remarkable. She'd like to study their biology at some point, if that was on the table. She said that as for the threat question, humans have been finding inventive ways to threaten each other for several thousand years, with considerable creativity, and had not yet managed to finish the job. A fleet was a fleet, a big one, but it was not new information to a species that had grown up on a planet full of things trying to kill it. We are not brave, she said. We are just not particularly surprised. The chamber stayed quiet for a moment after that. Veth Oranu sat in the senior gallery. She watched Lena Vasquez return to her place beside the other humans. She watched the way the crew stood, not rigidly, not performing courage, but with the loose-limbed ease of people who had done this before in some form. Not this specifically, not a Dominion trial chamber, but the general shape of it, the standing in front of something large and waiting to see what it decided. She had spent 30 years trying to understand what power looked like when it entered a room. She had a theory, developed over those 30 years, that the most dangerous thing in any room was the thing that did not need to prove it was dangerous. She looked at Dale Harmon. He was waiting again, the same way he had waited in that first 6-second silence when she hadn't fired. Comfortable in the wait, not absent, present and patient, and watching the room with the quiet attention of someone who was taking it all in. Sendivar called Cole Briggs to speak. Cole stood at the center of the chamber and looked like a man who had been dreading this specific moment since the jump went wrong. He was pale, in the way humans got when the blood pulled away from the surface, but he stood straight. He explained the navigation error. The variable he had missed. The margin of error in the experimental drive. The fact that the drive was technically on an unauthorized sabbatical test run, because Rei Okubo had not properly communicated that to anyone. He did not leave anything out. He did not soften any of it. He said that if he had the jump to do again, he would check the variable he missed, obviously. But he could not say he wished the jump had never happened, because it had brought his crew here, and here had turned out to be extraordinary. Sendevar asked him, from across the chamber, if he was sorry for the incursion. Cole was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry for the trouble it caused," he said. "I'm not sorry about where we landed." The room held that sentence for a while. Sendevar deliberated in private for 2 hours. Kale Bin stayed in the gallery the entire time, writing. When Sendevar returned to the chamber, he read the ruling at standard pace. He covered the procedural elements, the legal citations, the framework under which the decision had been reached. All of that was normal. All of that was the expected shape of a Dominion ruling. Near the end, he used a word. He used it once, without pausing, in the middle of a legal clause, and then moved past it. The word was peer. Not subject, not foreign organism, not incident, peer. Kalebine's pen stopped moving on his notepad. He sat very still. He looked at what he had written. He looked at Sendevar, who had already moved on to the next clause and was not looking at anyone. Kalebind wrote the word down. He drew a small line under it. He did not know what it meant for the Dominion yet. It was the kind of word that once spoken in a room like this could not be taken back out again. It lived there now, in the official record, in the 1500 years of walls around it. There. The ruling was formal and complicated, and took 14 minutes to read in full. The short version was this: provisional non-hostile status granted. 1-year observation period, beginning from the date the ardent margin crossed back over the sovereign boundary. A formal information exchange treaty, jointly drafted, with terms to be negotiated by both sides within the observation year. And one standing requirement, written into the record in plain language at Sendevar's specific instruction. The ardent margin was required to file a flight plan before its next entry into Dominion space. That was the whole requirement: file a flight plan. The penalty for not filing one was not specified. Kalebin thought this was intentional. He thought Sendevar was leaving a door open that the law usually kept bolted. He wrote this down and did not include it in any official report. The morning after the ruling, Pam Ortega met 3 Dominion engineers in the docking bay. The meeting was not scheduled. Pam had gone down to look at the tractor array housing from the outside, and had found a maintenance team already there, doing a calibration check. She had looked at their equipment for about 30 seconds, and then pointed at a coupling joint on the secondary arm that was, by her assessment, running slightly hot. One of the engineers had looked where she pointed. He had gone to his diagnostics unit, checked the reading, and looked back at her with an expression that did not require translation. That was how it started. 14 hours later, Pam Ortega and 3 Dominion engineers were sitting on the floor of the docking bay, surrounded by components from the tractor array's power routing system, and several large pieces of paper covered in diagrams. The language barrier had been resolved by the 3rd hour. Diagrams did not need language. A coupling joint running hot looked the same in any system. The solution to it involved the same principles regardless of who built the machine. Rei Okubo wandered in at hour 11. He looked at the diagrams. He said something. One of the Dominion engineers said something back. The translation unit struggled. Rei picked up a piece of paper and drew something on the back. The engineer studied it. Rei added a second diagram. The engineer pointed at a number in the second diagram. They argued about it for 40 minutes. Not in a bad way. In the good way. The way people argued when they both understood the problem and disagreed about the solution, and could not wait to find out who was right. Pam watched them and said nothing. She cleaned a component with a rag. She was smiling, but not widely enough that anyone would notice unless they knew where to look. Nadia Fenn spent the morning in the library again. The librarian, a small, quiet Solor archivist, had started leaving texts out for her. Not recommended texts, but texts the archivist thought she would find interesting, based on what she had been reading. It was the librarian's way of having a conversation without having one. Nadia understood this way of talking. She did it herself. She left a note on the return shelf when she brought the text back. Not a long note, 3 sentences, a reaction to one of the texts and a question about another. She did not sign it with her name, just a small symbol she used in her notebook margins. The archivist found the note that afternoon. She held it for a long time. She had never received a note before. Cale Bind found Nadia on the station walkway in the late afternoon. He had been writing and rewriting the same paragraph of his observation report since the ruling, and he needed to walk. He had not expected to find anyone out here. She did not seem surprised to see him. She moved over slightly to share the rail. They stood for a while without talking. He asked, eventually, why humans rope things down. He had been thinking about it since the library visit. It seemed inefficient. They had recording devices, they had data storage, and still the notebook, still the paper. She thought about it for a moment. Because it happened, she said. And it deserves to exist somewhere that isn't a file. He turned that over. The notebook is the file, he said. The notebook is mine, she said. The file belongs to whoever owns the system. He was quiet. Then he said, I think I understand that. She went back to looking at the dock. He went back to his room and rewrote the paragraph. On the last evening, Dale Harmon had a short meeting with Sen Devar. No staff, no documentation, just 2 people in the small room outside the station's primary conference hall. The room was meant for pre-meeting preparations and had 2 chairs and a low table and nothing else. Sen Devar sat across from Dale and asked, with the directness of a man who had spent his career inside formal language and had decided to step outside it for one conversation, if humans were always like this. Dale thought about it. More or less, he said. Sen Devar asked what it was like, to walk into the unknown and not be afraid. Dale looked at him for a long moment. He picked up his coffee mug, which was with him, as it always was, and turned it in his hands. We just don't let the afraid part drive. Sen Devar was very still. Dale set the mug down. He said he hoped the observation year went well. He said the Dominion had built something extraordinary here, and he meant it with no angle behind it. He said the Ardent Margin would file its flight plan next time. Sen Devar said that would be appreciated. They shook hands. It was the second human handshake Sen Devar had experienced. The first had been Dale's when the trial ruling was issued, and he had spent a day afterward trying to decide what to do with the memory of it. It was such a small, warm, direct thing. No hierarchy in it, no formal distance. Just 2 hands and the simple meaning of, I see you. I met you here. He walked back to his office and stood at his desk for a while, without sitting down. He did not know what the observation year would bring. He had a suspicion it would bring more humans, not because they had been given permission, but because the kind of people who took a wrong turn into an empire and asked if there was a traffic authority were exactly the kind of people who would come back with better maps and more questions. He filed the paperwork. He made sure the word pier was spelled correctly in the record. The Ardent Margin undocked at 600 hours the next morning. Pam had run every system check twice. The drive was cleaner than it had been at launch. The tractor frequency data was stored, quietly in a personal file she had not labeled with anything useful. The engine was not on fire. She called this a success. Cole Briggs ran the navigation calculation 4 times. He triple-checked the variable he had missed. He looked at the exit coordinates, the jump path, the margin of error, and felt the specific sick feeling that had lived in his chest since the original miscalculation slowly begin to loosen. He still had the clearance document from the trial. It was folded in his jacket pocket. He planned to frame it when he got home. Below it, he was going to write, in black marker, "Still worth it." The ardent margin powered up its drive. The dock hummed around it. At the outer edge of the dock window, two of the Dominion engineers from the tractor project stood watching. Pam saw them from the engine bay camera. She raised one hand. One of them raised a hand back. The ship jumped. Clean this time. Vethoranu was at the primary observation deck when the jump signature flared and faded. She watched the empty space where the ship had been. The jump had been precise, elegant even. A different quality from the chaotic shuddering entry they had made a week ago. She had read Pam Ortega's profile. She was not surprised. Her second-in-command came to stand beside her. She was quiet for a while. The space where the ship had been was just space again. Ordinary, quiet, unoccupied. He asked what she was thinking. She said she was thinking about the observation year, about what happened when it ended, and the humans came back. Not if. There was no if. She could feel the certainty of it the same way you felt weather coming before the instruments confirmed it. She said she was already thinking about how to adjust the formation to accommodate more of them. Her second-in-command said nothing. He looked out at the empty space. The stars did not change. They did not care what had happened here. They had been burning for billions of years, and they would keep burning. The sovereign boundary existed because someone had drawn it. The law existed because someone had written it. And the word peer existed in a 600-year-old record now because someone had said it and meant it. Kaelbind Uros filed his final observation report from his quarters at 0700. It was long, careful, thorough, and covered every relevant detail of the crew's stay in the proper format. The last line was not in the proper format. It was not in any format he had been trained in. It was just a sentence. One sentence, submitted without revision. Humanity does not need the galaxy to make room for them. They will simply build the room themselves and assume everyone is welcome. He sent it before the second thought arrived. He did not wait to hear what his superiors thought. He already knew what he thought.